This is a story for those who know that the truest promises are not shouted in the rain, but whispered in the quiet of a lamplit room. It is for the heart that understands that love is not a rescue from peril, but the slow, steady building of a home in another's care, one carefully placed hand at a time. The silence of the house was a weight Elias Thorne had learned to carry. It settled in the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun, clung to the cold iron of the stove, and pooled in the empty chair across his small kitchen table. His life was a testament to order, a bulwark against the chaos that had stolen his wife 2 years prior. Floors were swept, fences were mended, and the fire was always banked before he turned in. He moved through his homestead near the small frontier town of Promise with a stoic competence that left little room for wasted words or gestures. His hands, calloused from the plow and sure with a rifle, knew work, not tenderness. Yet every evening, as he checked the latch on his daughter's door, a buried desire for belonging ached in his chest, sharp and persistent. Lily, all of 6 years old with her mother's wide eyes, was the one soft thing in his world of hard edges. Her breathing in the quiet of the night was the only sound that soothed the profound loneliness underscored by his orderly routines. He often stood in the doorway, a tall, unmovable silhouette, listening. He was her protector, a role he understood. But the hush of a house too silent for 3 souls, now holding only 2, was a constant, hollow reminder of what was missing. The bed was made for one, the lamp cast a single shadow on the wall, and the quiet was a companion he had never invited. He would check the perimeter of his land, his gaze scanning the horizon not for threats, but from a habit born of a duty that now felt like a hollow echo. Then he would return to the house, the scent of summer dust and dry grass clinging to his clothes, and the silence would welcome him home like a shroud. Clara Vance arrived in Promise, with nothing but a small carpet bag, and a fear so deep it had become a permanent chill in her bones. She was running, not from the law, but from a man who believed a signed paper made her his property. Jedediah Finch was a man of entitlement and coercive charm, a predator cloaked in the respectability of wealth. Her escape had been a desperate, calculated flight, leaving behind a life of suffocated dignity for the terrifying uncertainty of the open road. Safety, for her, was not a given. It was a destination she had to build with her own 2 hands, and it had to come with dignity. She would not be a burden. In the town's mercantile, clutching the few coins she had left, she heard the whispers. A widower, out on a remote homestead with a young daughter. A man who kept to himself, honorable but hard as granite. He needed help. The thought of placing herself under another man's roof sent a tremor of her old fear through her, but the alternative, starvation or, worse, being found by Jedediah, was unthinkable. She walked the dusty track out to the Thorne farm, her resolve a fragile shield. The house was simple, sturdy, and impeccably kept. When Elias Thorne opened the door, he was exactly as described, tall, quiet, with eyes that listened more than they spoke. His stoicism was a wall, but she saw no cruelty in it. He listened to her offer housekeeping, cooking, childcare, for room and board, with a still careful consideration. His gaze was unervingly perceptive, as if he were reading the story of her exhaustion in the lines around her eyes. The arrangement was a practical one, a solution to 2 different kinds of desperation. But it was the small girl who peeked from behind his legs who sealed the compact. Lily looked at her not with a child's simple curiosity, but with a profound and aching hope. As Clara made to leave, promising to return with her things, the child's small hand shot out and grabbed a fold of her skirt. "Please," the little girl whispered, her voice trembling with a fear Clara knew intimately. "Please don't leave us too." Elias's gaze met Clara's over his daughter's head. In that shared moment, the practical arrangement fractured and reformed into something heavier, something more fragile. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a welcome, not yet. It was an agreement. Clara's heart, which had been a tight, panicked fist for weeks, eased its clench, just a fraction. This was not a home, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a safe harbor. The first days were a study in careful distances. Elias Thorne was a man who moved with purpose, and Clara learned the rhythm of his homestead as one learns a subtle and complex language. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake the house. He would be gone for hours, the only evidence of his labor the neat stacks of firewood he left by the door, or the freshly tilled earth in the garden. He spoke little, but she began to realize his silence was not one of disapproval. It was a space he held for others to fill. He listened, he watched, he noticed. Clara's domain became the kitchen and the small living space, and she poured her own need for order into her work. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards gleamed, baked bread that filled the quiet rooms with a warm, yeasty scent, and mended the small tears in Lily's dresses with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. One afternoon, Elias came in from the fields, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes fixed on a freshly mended shirt of his she had laid out on a chair, the cuff repaired with her neat, precise handiwork. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered on the stitches as if they were a line of poetry he was committing to memory. From that day on, a small change occurred in their routine. When he poured the coffee in the morning, he would fill her mug first, pushing it gently toward her side of the table. It was a gesture so small it was almost nothing, but in the vast silence between them, it felt as loud as a declaration. She began to understand that this was his language: service, provision, a quiet and steady attentiveness. He never entered her small room without knocking softly first. He never assumed. He never took. He asked always with his eyes or a slight inclination of his head. Clara, who had spent a lifetime steeling herself against the casual entitlement of men, found herself slowly, cautiously, disarming. The tension in her shoulders began to ease. She learned to read him in return, the slight tightening of his jaw that meant the fields were too dry, the rare, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when he watched Lily draw at the kitchen table. Trust was not a conversation they had. It was a structure they were building together, one silent, respectful gesture at a time. Clara's presence began to coax the color back into the muted tones of the Thorne homestead. Laughter, a sound that had been absent for too long, started to bubble up from Lily, and sometimes a quiet smile would touch Clara's own lips in response. Her greatest joy was the afternoon spent with the little girl, a slate and chalk between them on the kitchen table. She taught Lily her letters, guiding her small hand to form the elegant, looping shapes. The girl was a bright, eager student, her brow furrowed in concentration, her tongue sticking out from the corner of her mouth. Elias would often come in from the fields and pause in the doorway, watching them. He would stand there, silent and still, the scent of sun and earth clinging to him. He never interrupted, but Clara could feel the weight of his attention, as solid and steady as his presence. It wasn't a gaze of suspicion, but one of quiet, hungry observation. He was watching his daughter unfurl under Clara's gentle care, and a look of profound, aching gratitude would soften the hard lines of his face. One evening, after a long day of canning peaches, Clara was overcome with exhaustion. She sat down in the rocking chair by the hearth, intending only to rest her eyes for a moment, while Elias read a farm ledger at the table. When she woke, the room was dark, save for the soft glow of the lamp by his elbow. A thick wool blanket was tucked securely around her shoulders, and the ledger was closed on the table. Elias was gone, presumably to his own bed. He had covered her, had let her sleep, had moved about the room, and extinguished the other lamps without waking her. The act of care was so profound in its quietness, it made her breath catch. He had tended to her comfort, without expectation, without announcement. It was a secret act of gentleness, and it settled deep inside her, a small, warm stone in the cold sea of her past experiences. She began to see his competence not as hardness, but as a form of protection. His controlled, deliberate movements were a promise of safety. He was a man who mended what was broken, whether it was a fence post or the frayed edges of a weary soul. Her guardedness, the shield she had carried for so long, was beginning to feel heavy, and in the quiet safety of his house, she felt the first tentative yearning to set it down. Summer heat gave way to the first rumblings of autumn storms. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper through the cornfields, began to howl around the corners of the small house, rattling the window panes like a restless spirit. One night, the sky broke open. Rain lashed against the roof, and thunder cracked so violently it seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. In the midst of the tempest, a piercing cry cut through the noise. Lily. Before Clara could even push her own blanket aside, Elias was already moving down the short hall, his steps sure and silent in the dark. Clara followed, her heart aching for the terrified child. She found them in Lily's room, the little girl wrapped in her father's arms, her small body trembling with violent sobs. "The thunder," she cried, burying her face in his shoulder. "It's too loud." Elias held her, murmuring words too low for Clara to hear, his large hand stroking her hair. But his comfort, born of a stoic and silent love, couldn't quell the storm-fed terror. Clara knelt by the bed. "Lily," she said softly. The child looked at her, her eyes wide and wet in the intermittent flashes of lightning. Clara began to speak, not of the storm being harmless, but of a story, a simple tale of a little field mouse who used the sound of the thunder to dance. Elias fell silent, watching as Clara's quiet, steady voice spun a world of gentle magic that slowly, surely, drew the fear from his daughter. He watched as Lily's sobs subsided into hiccups, and her tight grip on his shirt relaxed. He had never seen such a thing. He could protect his daughter from any physical threat, but he did not have the tools to calm the storms inside her. Clara did. Eventually, Lily's breathing deepened into sleep, her head resting in the crook of her father's arm. The storm outside had lessened to a steady, drumming rain. Elias looked at Clara across the small bed, his gaze raw with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice thick. The air in the room was charged, intimate. To send her back to her cold room seemed a cruelty. "Your room is cold," he stated, a plain fact. He hesitated, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. "My bed is warm. There is room." His eyes were serious, holding hers, making a silent vow. "I will not touch you. I'll put a bolster between us." It was not a proposition. It was an offer of comfort, of shared warmth against the storm, rooted in the deepest respect. It was an invitation that left all the power in her hands. She saw the truth of his promise in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the honor that was as much a part of him as his own bones. The survivor in her, the woman who had fought for every scrap of her own agency, recognized the profound deference in his offer. Her answer was quiet, but clear. Yes. Carrying the sleeping child between them, they moved to his room. The space was like the man himself, spare, clean, and functional. He gently laid Lily on one side of the large bed, and as promised, placed a long, firm bolster down the middle. The division was clear, a tangible representation of the boundary he had offered. Clara slipped under the covers on her side, the cotton sheets cool against her skin at first, then slowly warming with the shared heat of the mattress. Lying there in the near dark, separated by only a roll of cloth, the air was thick with a new and terrifying intimacy. She could hear him breathe. It was a slow, steady sound, the rhythm of a calm and constant heart. The rain pattered on the roof, a gentle counterpoint to the wild storm that had thrown them together. She did not sleep for a long time, too aware of the man lying just inches away. This was a proximity born of practicality, but it felt like something else entirely, a mutual choice to deepen their fragile connection. The next morning, They rose before Lily and moved about the kitchen in a silence that was different from before. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the weighted silence of two people who had shared something profound and unspoken. Later that day, Elias returned from the fields for his midday meal. He unstrapped the rifle from his back, a tool as familiar to him as his own hand. Instead of leaning it in its usual corner, he turned to Clara, who was kneading bread at the kitchen table. He held the rifle out to her, stock first, the barrel pointed safely at the floor. His eyes met hers, and in that simple gesture, he gave her everything. He was giving her his trust, his protection, and the power over his own weapon. It was a statement more powerful than any vow. She wiped the flour from her hands, her movements deliberate, and took the heavy weight of the rifle from him. Her fingers closed around the smooth, worn wood. She held it for a moment, the balance of it unfamiliar but solid, before placing it carefully in the corner. When she turned back, Elias was watching her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. It was a small, unguarded thing, but it transformed his serious face, lighting it from within. And as Lily ran in from outside, chasing a butterfly, Clara heard her own name spoken by him for the first time, not as a formal address, but softly, like a question she was only now ready to answer. Clara. The sound of it, in his low voice, was a comfort she had never known she was seeking. The arrival of Jedediah Finch and Promise was not a storm, but a slow, creeping poison. He did not ride out to the farm. He was more cunning than that. He took a room at the town's only hotel, conducted his business with the local land agent, and let the insidious power of gossip do his work for him. Word traveled fast. A wealthy man from the East, asking after a woman named Clara Vance, a woman who, he claimed, was his betrothed, a runaway who had broken a sacred contract. The story was crafted to paint him as the victim, the honorable man seeking to reclaim his due. The townspeople, who had come to regard Clara with a quiet respect, now looked at her with suspicion during her weekly trips for supplies. The whispers followed her out of the mercantile, sharp and stinging as burrs. The social pressure was a cage, and Clara felt its bars closing in around her. Her old fear returned, a cold knot in her stomach. She grew quiet, her newfound ease at the homestead evaporating, replaced by a constant humming anxiety. Elias saw the change in her immediately. He saw the way she started at sudden noises, the way her eyes darted toward the road. He saw the return of the haunted look she'd worn upon her arrival. One evening, after Lily was asleep, he found her sitting at the dark kitchen table, staring at her hands. The lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. He didn't speak, simply lit another lamp, pushing back the darkness. He sat opposite her, the solid weight of his presence a silent question. He waited, and in the safety of the warm, golden light, the story she had held so tightly within her finally spilled out. She told him of the arranged marriage, of Finch's possessiveness, of the way he looked at her, as if she were a prized Mare to be bought and tamed. She spoke of his dishonorable nature, hidden beneath a veneer of charm, and of her desperate, necessary flight. As she spoke, Elias listened, his face carved from stone, his hands resting on the table, but his stillness was not passive. It was the stillness of a predator gathering itself, of a protector identifying a threat. His jaw was a hard, tight line, and a muscle ticked in his cheek. When she finished, her voice a raw whisper, the silence that fell was not empty, but filled with his cold, contained fury. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy solutions. He simply reached one hand across the table, not to touch her, but to rest, palm up, in the space between them. An offering. A silent declaration of alliance. After her confession, the kitchen's lamplight seemed to hold them in a sacred confidence. The air was still, charged with the weight of her revealed past. Elias let the silence settle, allowing her words to find their place in the room, in the space that was now theirs. Then he withdrew his hand and spoke, his voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the tremor that still lingered in hers. He told her of his late wife, Mary. He spoke not of the sickness that took her, but of the silence that came after. He described the crushing weight of running a farm and raising a child alone, the way his world had shrunk to the boundaries of his land and the edges of his grief. It was not a plea for pity, but a confession of his own profound loneliness, an admission that the order in his life was a defense against a sorrow so deep he feared it might swallow him whole. He was offering her his own vulnerability, meeting her backstory with his. He was showing her the broken places inside himself, trusting her with his own story of survival. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They were no longer just a man and a woman, bound by a practical arrangement, but two souls who recognized the scars on the other. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Jedediah Finch has no claim on you here," he said, the words a plain and simple vow. "This is your home. You are safe here." He paused, his next words crucial, deliberate. "If you want to stay?" The invitation hung in the air, a choice, not an obligation. He was offering her a future, a partnership, a permanent place not just in his house, but in his life, and in Lily's. He was giving her back the agency Finch had tried to steal. Before she could answer, he rose and went to the small mantelpiece where he sometimes sat in the evenings, carving scraps of wood. He picked up a small, exquisitely detailed carving of a songbird, its wings half unfurled. He had been working on it for weeks. He brought it back to the table, but instead of giving it to her, he held it out. "For Lily," he said softly. "From us." It was a symbolic gift of staggering significance. He was inviting her into the circle of his family, asking her to share in the sacred duty of raising his child. It was the ultimate act of trust, the ultimate offering of a shared life. With trembling fingers, Clara took the small wooden bird. It was warm from his hand. "Yes," she whispered, the single word encompassing everything. "I want to stay." Jedediah Finch did not wait for his gossip to fell its quarry. When it became clear Clara was not going to be shamed or starved into returning to town, he came for her. He arrived in a hired buggy, the town sheriff beside him looking uncomfortable and out of place. Finch was dressed in fine city clothes that looked absurd against the rustic backdrop of the farm. He strode onto the porch as if he owned it, his face a mask of aggrieved entitlement. Elias met him at the door. He did not stand in front of Clara, but slightly to the side, a silent affirmation that they were a united front. Clara stood her ground, her fear a cold fire in her belly, but her spine was steel. Lily, sensing the danger, clung to Clara's skirt. "Mr. Thorne," Finch began, his voice smooth and condescending. "I am Jedediah Finch. I've come for my betrothed, Miss Vance." He held up a document. "We have a contract." Elias did not even glance at the paper. His eyes were fixed on Finch, his expression unreadable, but radiating a dangerous calm. "Miss Vance is not property," he said, his voice flat and even. "She makes her own choices." Finch's mask of civility slipped. "This is a family matter, a legal matter. It does not concern you, farmer." He took a step forward, his gaze locking on Clara, his voice dropping to a coercive purr. "Clara, stop this foolishness. Come home." This was the moment, the culmination of all the quiet trust, the shared vulnerabilities. This was the decisive, non-violent confrontation. Clara stepped forward slightly, her hand resting on Lily's head in a protective gesture. She did not look to Elias for permission or for rescue. She looked directly at the man who had been the shadow over her life. "I am home, Jedediah," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a finality that could not be argued. "My place is here." The words were simple, but they were the most powerful vow she had ever made. Finch's face contorted with rage. He looked from her defiant face to Elias's immovable presence. He saw the partnership in their stance, the wordless signals that passed between them. A slight shift in Elias's weight, a steadying breath from Clara. He saw he was not facing a frightened woman and a simple farmer. He was facing a family. The sheriff, reading the situation and the iron will in Elias Thorne's eyes, cleared his throat. "Mr. Finch," he said quietly, "the lady has made her choice. There's nothing more to be done here." Defeated, his power rendered impotent by their quiet unity, Jedediah Finch turned and stormed back to his buggy, the legal papers crushed in his fist. As the buggy disappeared down the lane, Elias's gaze found Clara's. He didn't touch her, but his eyes conveyed everything: pride, relief, and a deep, unwavering devotion. They had chosen each other. The departure of Jedediah Finch left a vacuum in its wake. The adrenaline that had sharpened Clara's resolve and tightened Elias's muscles drained away, leaving a profound, trembling exhaustion. The threat was gone, but its echo remained. They retreated into the familiar sanctuary of the kitchen, the heart of the home they had just defended. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the sudden fragility of the moment. Without a word, Clara moved to the counter and began to slice vegetables for their evening meal, her body seeking the comfort of a familiar routine. But her hands were shaking, the knife unsteady. In a moment of distraction, the blade slipped, slicing deeply into the side of her index finger. A sharp cry escaped her lips, more from shock than pain. Blood, dark and shockingly red, welled instantly. Before she could even react, Elias was there. He gently took her hand, his touch infinitely careful. "Let me see," he murmured, his voice a low rumble of concern. He led her to the water pump, his grip on her wrist firm but tender, a steadying anchor. With a clean cloth, he washed the cut, his movements efficient and yet profoundly gentle. The sting of the water was nothing compared to the searing intimacy of his focused care. He was tending to her, his complete attention narrowed to her small injury. This was the aftercare, the quiet mending that followed the battle. He wrapped a strip of clean linen around her finger, his calloused thumb brushing against her palm, sending a jolt of warmth through her. His hands, which could tame the land and hold a rifle steady, were now a source of incredible comfort. The simple act of bandaging her finger was more tender than any kiss she could have imagined. Her eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of overwhelming relief and a love so potent it stole her breath. He finished his task, but he did not release her hand. He lifted it, his gaze holding hers, and softly pressed his lips to the clean white bandage. A vow sealed without a single word. He then turned to the half-prepared meal, took a piece of sliced apple, and held it to her lips. She parted them, accepting the offering, the crisp sweetness a welcome shock to her senses. In the quiet of the kitchen's lamplight, he fed her, a simple act of nourishment that felt like the most intimate communion of their lives. In the days that followed their public stand against Finch, the very atmosphere of the house shifted. The quiet that had once been born of loneliness and caution was now a comfortable silence, rich with unspoken understanding. The routines they had established, as a matter of necessity, became the rituals of a family. They moved around each other in the kitchen with an easy, fluid grace, a dance of domesticity, where hands brushed and glances were held for a moment longer than before. The bolster on the bed disappeared. The first night, Elias simply didn't put it there, and Clara came to her side of the bed to find the space open, in silent invitation. The line he had drawn was gone, erased by the trust they had forged. That night, and the nights that followed, were a slow, tender exploration. The spice of their intimacy was not in a fiery passion, but in the profound, sensory details of their closeness. It was in the hushed sound of their breathing in the dark, the warmth of his body seeping into hers, the surprising softness of his calloused hand as it carefully traced the line of her jaw in the moonlight. Desire was a quiet, steady flame, tended with careful consent. His touch was always a question, his eyes asking for permission before his hands moved. Her response was a yielded breath, a soft sound of assent, a turning toward him. Their intimacy was a language of hands and warmth and whispered names, a fade-to-black scene centered on tenderness. He learned the shape of her, the way she curled into his side as she slept. She learned the steady, solid beat of his heart against her ear, a rhythm that promised safety and devotion. Elias, the stoic protector, found a new purpose in his vigilance. His habit of scanning rooms for threats had evolved. Now he read her, learning the subtle cues of her body, the language of her needs. He would see the faint line of exhaustion between her brows and steer her toward a chair, a cup of tea appearing in her hands moments later. He was no longer just protecting her from the world. He was tending to her soul. She, in turn, brought a gentle softness to his hard-edged world, her presence a constant, reassuring warmth against the memory of his cold grief. They were mending each other, stitch by silent stitch. One clear, crisp morning, the world outside the windows of the small farmhouse seemed new and full of promise. The ordeal with Finch was a fading memory, a trial that had served only to temper the bond between them into something unbreakable. Clara was in the kitchen, humming softly as she kneaded dough, the familiar motion a comforting meditation. Lily sat at the table, drawing a picture of their house, with 3 figures holding hands under a smiling sun. The scene was one of perfect, ordinary domestic peace. Elias came in from the barn, the scent of hay and clean morning air clinging to him. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the room. He washed his hands at the pump, his movements deliberate as always, and came to stand beside Clara. He watched her hands work the dough for a moment, then gently placed his own over hers, stilling their motion. She looked up at him, her heart giving a familiar, happy lurch. His eyes were full of a deep, settled love. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring or a piece of jewelry, but a folded, official-looking document. It was the deed to the farm. He unfolded it on the flour-dusted table. There, next to his own strong signature, was a blank line, and beneath it, in the careful, blocky letters of a man unaccustomed to such things, he had written her name, Clara Vance Thorne. He pushed an inkwell and a pen toward her. "It was my farm," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with emotion. "Now it is ours." It was not a proposal of marriage in the traditional sense. It was something more profound. It was a statement of fact, a quiet vow of a shared future written in ink and soil. It was the promise of a named home, a place of belonging she had earned not through contract or obligation, but through love and mutual respect. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she took the pen. Her hand was steady as she signed her name, her new name, on the line. The ink sealed their future together. Lily, seeing the solemnity of the moment, looked up from her drawing. Elias knelt down, bringing his head level with his daughter's. "Clara is staying," he said softly. "Forever." Lily's face broke into a radiant smile, and she launched herself into Clara's arms. As Clara held the child, her cheek resting on Lily's soft hair, she met Elias's gaze over her head. He reached out, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder, his thumb stroking the fabric of her dress. In the warmth of the sunlit kitchen, surrounded by the scent of baking bread and the love of her found family, Clara knew she was, finally and truly, home.